you about FTC issues and disclosure issues and kind of claims issues. So first, we have to start by setting the scene. What is native advertising? There are a lot of definitions that are floating around out there that are really sort of B-school speak, and it can get kind of convoluted. But the basic idea, or how I like to think about it, is it's content from an advertiser that's going to be woven into the web pages that consumer readers are visiting. It's got some other names. The lawyers all call it native advertising, but some people might call it branded information or branded content. And really, how did we get here? It took us a while in the evolution of internet marketing. I mean, first, way back when, there was email marketing. And then in the 90s, we saw the birth of the display or the banner ad. Around 2000, we have Google AdWords that appears on the scene for broad sponsored search advertising. But frankly, a lot of these advancements have turned into marketing disappointments. A decade or so ago, people were saying that the click-through rates for banner ads were estimated at about 9%. Today, Google, which owns DoubleClick, so has an interest in this, has estimated today that click-through rates are at 0.9%, and that's really the highest I've seen. Some estimate it as low as 0.2%. So these kinds of messages aren't getting to consumers. So here we have native. So what is it, or what forms can it take? Well, it can be sponsored tweets or pins or other placement on social media. This is often called social native. It can be paid placement on the bottom of a traditional news page that's going to take you around the world or to recommended links, or basically another place on the web, either with advertising or other native sponsored content. We see sponsored placement in news feeds. We're even finding ads that are getting into inbox text messaging with the help of services such as Pinger. Now, what I think some people would say is really more traditional native is longer pieces. Things like cute, short, fluff pieces like BuzzFeed's lists that are sponsored or brought to you by a company. Or what probably the brand.com folks are focused on, and what we're going to be talking more about today, is really full-on articles, like the one that the Church of Scientology sponsored in the Atlantic Monthly. Most people have read about this. This proved to be a big embarrassment, and it caused the Atlantic to begin putting into place guidelines around accepting native advertising. But it's not even just articles or written words anymore, but multimedia with YouTube videos. And really, the question on the marketing side is, can this work? I don't know if you've seen, John Oliver did a great send-up of native advertising that I encourage you to search for and watch. Not now, after this presentation, of course. But one of the many funny things he said is he likened news to licorice and good advertising to guacamole. And he said both great on their own, but sort of unstable when you mix them together. So that really is the big question. Is it possible for brands and their supporting armies from ad agencies, from marketing departments, and PR squads, or new companies like brand.com to create content that is so good that people seek it out? Well, just like how cable and now internet shows are saying, hey, we can do better than networks, marketers are really convinced that they can create content that promotes their products but also is entertaining. A great example is what you see on your screen now. This is an article that Netflix placed on the New York Times the week that the new season of Orange is the New Black came out. It was not at all about hyping the show, but it was an interactive news piece that looked at problems with how the U.S. prison system is dealing with female inmates. I was very intrigued by this, not only because I'm always looking for good examples of native advertising, but I was really interested in the content. I actually read the whole article, and I really enjoyed it. And the focus obviously was not on the show, but it actually got me really interested in looking forward to watching the new season. So that is really the nirvana of native advertising. But Poe and I are not marketers. We are lawyers. So we're not here today to tell you it's possible or how to do it. You know that. We're here to tell you how to stay out of legal trouble when going down this road. And just as Native itself is developing on the marketing side, the laws and the rules are developing as well. But the timing is exactly right to think about this and think about this seriously while Native is exploding. I saw an article earlier this week in Business Insider, and they were collecting and projecting some data that they gathered and the Interactive Advertising Bureau had gathered. And they estimated that total Native spend in 2014 is going to hit almost $8 billion. And then they estimated that it's going to grow to $21 billion by 2018. Now, these numbers were combined spend. They included the spending on the Native-style display ads, the social Native, and those longer articles or the sponsored content. But just that sponsored content is growing too. And the estimates from that article were that there's $1 billion in spend on pieces like this Netflix piece in 2014, and this is going to grow to $3.4 billion by 2018. So let's get to the legal stuff. All right, so a first question. Well, we're going to go through a bunch of questions and answers today. Poe and I have drafted some of them for you, and of course we'll take your questions after. But some of the things we think are on your mind. And a first question that a lot of people ask is, well, if you're writing full-on articles, isn't this protected speech? Now, how can the FTC or any government agency have the power to control what I say? And the First Amendment does protect all speech. But if the speech is commercial, it gets a little bit watered down or lesser protection. Now, everybody recognizes the good old-fashioned print advertorial when we see one. This is where you have discussion of a product, but with more words behind it, where there's more content to it. But some content that we're seeing on the web doesn't really talk about a product, but instead it sets up a mood, it sets up a vibe that a marketer wants you to associate with their company. And the question is, does a marketer always need to disclose when they're behind a piece of this content? And really it comes down to the definition of what is commercial versus non-commercial speech. And the FTC looked at this in 1988 in a case involving an editorial that was placed by R.J. Reynolds that questioned the link between smoking and heart disease. And the FTC was concerned about the soundness of that study. So they were really looking at the science itself and whether it was sound. And they were investigating RJR. And what RJR said is, hey, when you come after us for things like this opinion piece, this is an expression of our opinion. This is not commercial speech. So the FCC doesn't have any power to regulate it or ask me questions about it. And when there are a number of factors, though, that a judge or that the FTC looks at when they're making this initial evaluation as to whether speech is commercial. And one is, does the speech seek to benefit the economic interests of the speaker by promoting a sale of its product? There are basically 5 factors. Does it promote the product or brand? Does it reference the brand's product, even generically, without brand identification? Does it discuss product attributes? Is the placement paid for? And does the speaker or sponsor have an economic or commercial motivation? Not all of these factors are required to be present. Probably one is not sufficient, but it really is a weighing or a balancing. Now the next question is, well, so what? Why do consumers need to be told when content is advertising? While we wait for the FTC to begin issuing cases, there is a body in New York called the National Advertising Division, or the NAD, and it's a self-regulatory arm of the Better Business Bureau, and it decides advertising cases, cases it brings itself, or sometimes cases that competitors raise. And it's looked at 5 different examples of native advertising in the last year. And the first case that it looked at was a case involving Qualcomm, or a maker of computer processors. And Qualcomm placed in Mashable a series of articles that looked at cool stuff that powered other devices. The articles didn't talk about computer processors, didn't talk about any product that Qualcomm specifically made. But what the NAD said is, If the story talks about a product, its benefits, or a competing product, even if it's in sort of that range of products, there's a need to disclose that the advertiser promoted the content. And why? What they said is consumers have a compelling interest to know the sponsor of the content when the content conveys a commercial message that benefits the advertisers. So people might want to know who's behind the articles they're reading, but why would they be legally entitled to know in cases where there's a commercial message? The FTC has some general guidance in its deception policy statement. And what the FTC tells us is that an omission of information that misleads a consumer and affects their purchasing decisions is material and it's deceptive. There have been a couple of cases that the FTC has brought. They're oldies but goodies. In the late 80s and early 90s, with the appearance of infomercials after the change in FCC regulations regarding the commercial content of television. And the FTC was concerned that commercials looked like talk shows or news programs, and that a consumer might believe they were being given objective information about a product rather than a sales pitch. And there was a settlement, in this case, the JS&A Group case, and that involved the company that made blue blocker glasses. And the blue blocker infomercial essentially was set up to look like investigative journalism or look like a spot out of 60 Minutes. And in an attempt to alleviate the concerns, the FTC required that any infomercial longer than 15 minutes must disclose it's a paid advertisement at least twice during the program. And this is the standard that we now see today anytime there are long-form infomercials on television. Some other more recent examples are cases that the FTC has brought against what they call flogs or fake blogs. And the example on the screen is when you see that they alleged discussed the medical benefits of acai berry and did it in a way that made it look like objective news when it was sponsored by the makers of these products, and then it also gave information that wasn't truthful. And when the FTC went after these flog folks, they said, we're enforcing our endorsement and testimonial guides. And those guides give some really helpful information when we look at guidance for native advertising. And what the endorsement and testimonial guides tell us is that an endorsement's got to be truthful, that a marketer can't say through an endorsement what a marketer couldn't say directly. If there's performance benefits that are discussed, it's got to be typical of what an average user can expect, or if it's not, you've got to tell consumers the expected results. What the FTC also said is that the burden falls primarily on the marketer to make sure that these endorsements are appropriate and that any affiliations between the marketer and the publisher are disclosed. And anytime it's not obvious that an endorser is being compensated, this also has to be disclosed. In a similar case that this National Advertising or NAD brought recently involved a company called eSalon. And they looked at a website that was hosted by eSalon, which is a company that sells hair color. And the website, which was called Hair Color for Women, had general information about hair color. Now, eSalon had originally disclosed that it ran this site, but the NAD was concerned that the disclosure was in small print at the bottom of the website, and this wasn't sufficient. So what they recommended, and what you see on this screen, is disclosure that eSalon runs this site at the top of the page. And they said that it should be repeated on all of the pages on the website. Now, this is a little bit of an easy call when the site is like this, that it's specifically talking about these products at issue. Another question that many people ask is, well, what if I'm not really talking about the product? If it's just product placement, is there always a need to disclose in that case? And this is one that the FTC has looked at, not in connection with native, but just general product placement questions. And in 2005, the FTC was asked to investigate product placement on TV and to promulgate some guidelines. There was a public interest group called Commercial Alert that raised concerns that consumers were deceived when these lines were blurred between advertising and programming. And the FTC considered their request, and they wrote back and they said, quote, some products appear in programming because advertisers pay for such placement, while other products appear because of the creative judgment of the program's writers. We are not aware of any empirical data concerning whether consumers distinguish between these two uses of products and programming. Assuming, however, that consumers are not aware when an advertiser is paid for a product to appear in programming, does not appear that failure to identify the placement as advertising violates the FTC Act. Now, the letter went on to say that the reason to identify an ad is that consumers may give more credence or credibility to objective representation about a product than to sponsored statements. But, for example, when you see American Idol hosts who are seen drinking cups with the Coca-Cola logo, the FTC wrote, the product appears on screen, but the product's performance is not discussed. Therefore, the rationale for disclosing that an advertiser paid for a product placement is absent. And the NAD brought a case, another case that looked at native, and this was the case involving Shape Water. Now, this was not on the web. This was a print piece. But here they said that it was more than product placement. That there was a discussion of Shape Water in Shape magazine, and that this content did talk about the product, and in that case, that the content is sponsored must be disclosed. So basically, there may be cases where content is more akin to product placement, and some examples that we might think of would be content that are produced by brand companies, say, on the Funny or Die website, that really have nothing to do with the product itself. They might show the product in a comedy sketch, or there could be other content that's produced entirely for entertainment value by a brand, attempting to engage consumers and develop general brand equity. In those cases, there may not be a legal duty to disclose the connection. But basically where we are now, and the bottom line is disclosure should be the default. Disclosure will never get you in trouble. If you're faced with a request not to disclose, you really need to examine the motivations about why very carefully, and then you need to examine the content very carefully. And if the content has a discussion of a product, a discussion of a competitor's product, or a discussion of a product category, it's very clear that there is an obligation to disclose. So with that basic background, now we can get into some more of the nitty-gritty. So how do we disclose? What are the right words? Here's a great example of one, if it's not the first, it's one of the first pieces of sponsored content on the New York Times when they decided to take the dip into native as well. And the New York Times obviously is concerned with its reputation as the highest of legitimate journalism. So wanted to be very clear when it accepted and posted sponsored content what it was doing. So what you see here is no less than 4 different disclosures that the content was here. We've got paid for and posted by Dell, written by Dell, paid post even in the top line, and then you see the shaded bar of paid posts. This is something lawyers might love, but this is certainly overkill and certainly not something that we see is what I think any lawyer would tell you is required by law. The NAD, which is a place we always go back to because they have given us, it's not the force of law, but good guidance in this area. The NAD was asked by a competitor to require, when content was sponsored, to identify it as, quote unquote, as advertisement. So to have this is the magic word. And what NAD said is, no, we're not, there's nothing magic about the word advertising. Without clear evidence presented to us that consumers are confused by other words like sponsored content or promoted content, we're not going to mandate or require any particular words or preclude any other words. Now, this is obviously something, are there magic words? What are the right words that's on the FTC's minds as well? And the example that I show you on screen is an example that the FTC used at a workshop that it held about a year ago, of December of 2013. And they held this workshop because the FTC is engaging in what I consider to be good government. They're not running ahead and bringing cases. They're gathering information about what native is and how it's used to help inform them, give guidance to businesses in this area. And one of the topics they addressed specifically in this workshop was investigating how publishers are disclosing, what are the words that they're using, and they also asked academics if they had conducted any research, consumer research in the area. Now, at that workshop, really no real conclusions reached, but this is certainly something that is top of the FTC's mind. Now, some people in the industry have suggested that there maybe should be different words used if a brand wrote or co-wrote the piece, similar to what you saw in that New York Times and the Dell Post, paid for, posted, written by Dell. And that maybe in the case where the brand simply provides some sort of financial support to the publisher but doesn't have an influence on the content that itself, that a different label, such as brought to you by, would be appropriate. And that may well be, but the bottom line is, at this point, think about the words that you use. Try to make sure that they accurately capture the connection, the actual connection between the advertiser and the publisher, but also know that there is flexibility here, at least at this point, and there are a variety of different options. Words like sponsored, words like promoted, words like advertisement, all those things are on the table, and can be fair game to use. All right, now moving beyond the what are the right words, another really, really important question is where and how are we going to disclose? And we have, again, not guidance from the FTC specifically in this area, but we have some guidance they've given in other analogous contexts that can really give us some very good information about what they're going to expect here. We look at search engines, and the FTC has twice sent letters to search engines warning them that they need to disclose sponsored search hits and distinguish them clearly from native search results. The FTC actually conducted some consumer research in this case, and they did give us some very specific suggestions on how to disclose or how to distinguish paid content. This is just an example of, Google's a verb now, but there are a number of different search engines out there, and all of them accept these dollars to show sponsored searches. And so what the FTC has told us is a couple of different things. First, they recommend using visual cues and or text labels to distinguish those paid from natural search results. The visibility of different background shading, or something they call luminosity, to distinguish sponsored from native results should be clearly distinguishable. They should also be noticeable on different devices, so the largest to the smallest, and in different lighting conditions, whether you've got your device outside in bright light or inside in dim light. And then these same rules are going to apply if you're going to use some kind of unique border instead of a different shading to separate those ads. And this goes to that research I mentioned that they did. If you're using text labels to separate ads from search results, they've got to be prominent, and they really should be located before the ad, not after, with a preference, not a requirement, but a preference that they be located in the top left corner. The FTC did some what they call basically eye tracking studies, where they looked at where consumers' eyes went on a page, and they said consumers are, for the most part, ignoring. I apologize for that. My second line just rang. But the FTC views consumers ignoring the bottom right corner. It just gets less attention. Um, some other places that the FTC has given us guidance is in something they call the .com disclosure. In my view, this is really required reading, and it gives key pointers for how to deal with disclosures of all kinds on the web, including in native advertising. And these were guidelines that the FTC had given, again, not force of law, but business guidance, that they gave about a decade ago, and then they updated it again a couple of years ago, recognizing that so many of us had transitioned just from desktop into mobile. And so they updated the guidance they've given. And with any disclosures on the web, what they've told us is, in their view, it's almost always better to include the information that content is sponsored in the piece itself, rather than with an asterisk and with small print. But at minimum, we want to always make sure that we're disclosing the fact of sponsorship, if not within the content, then certainly near to it. The FTC really, they've given the things they don't like, and they've been very vocal about that. They don't like a lot of scrolling or a need to move down the page to see required disclosures. They don't like hyperlinks when a disclosure is something simple, just simply like sponsorship. They haven't ruled out the idea of some type of symbol, but it would have to be something that the industry adopts, that it promotes, that is well recognized by consumers. And then just like in the search engine letters, they've said that the disclosure has to be clear and conspicuous on all devices and in all platforms. So let's give a couple of examples. I love The Onion. I'm a big consumer of The Onion. Here is an example, again, not that I think is what's absolutely required by law, but this one really has it all. It's got the highlighting. It's got a disclosure box at the top of an article. It's got a bolded call out that it's sponsored content. But then even the disclosure itself has a native feel. It's funny, it's self-deprecating, just like The Onion itself. Now here's another example from Funny or Die. Now this is not quite as in your face as The Onion example, but they do use a sponsored content or sponsored call out that's clear. It's at the top of each link to the video. But you can see it really visually fits with the layout of the rest of the page. This is one where I would say the disclosure itself is noticeable to consumers, but it tracks, it maps, it feels like the rest of the page. It feels like it fits in. So this is again sort of the nirvana of native advertising disclosure. Now, industry has gotten together, and it's always a good idea for industry to think about, to stave off regulation and enforcement, to create its own solutions to a problem. And we've begun to see that in this case. The publishers obviously have a vested interest in making sure that their credibility as journalists continue to survive. And so the American Society of Magazine Editors has put up some guidelines. In my view, these are really difficult. They're really hard. They're not really workable because what they're recommending is no real native integration, but clearly physical separation in different fonts, which is kind of the anti-native. The IAB has issued a native advertising playbook. They're very active in this space and have issued some guidelines and some which I think will continue to evolve. So that is a good place to go to see sort of current industry thinking and to get some best practices and get some recommendations. Now, our friends at the NAD have again given us some guidance on what they view as placement and prominence recommendations. This is again from their case involving Taboola. And no surprise, what they're suggesting really connects and fits in what the FTC has suggested. They do have a preference, not a requirement, for top left disclosure. And the shading and the contrast and the size are also discussed in that decision. But the bottom line here with all of this is the disclosure must be done in a way that consumers are likely to notice it. There's, again, flexibility in the how and the where, But when we look at this, the discussion should not start with the premise of how small can we make it, but rather the discussion should be about how can we make a clear and conspicuous disclosure that most naturally fits within the content. One short moment before I turn it over to Poe to talk about some other issues on content widgets, those around the world disclosures. What rules are going to apply there? The NAD has told us essentially that the same rules do apply, that a link needs to be identified as sponsored. What they've said is it's not sufficient if the ultimate content is labeled accurately, that in any place where you're taking consumers or readers away from a page to another page, you have an obligation right there to inform them that the content is sponsored. And that's a real challenge as content is shared throughout the web, how to make sure that disclosure continues to travel with it. I'm not sure if there are clear answers to that at this point, but it's a continuing challenge. And last but not least, the FTC, as I mentioned, had that workshop in 2013. They did gather a lot of information. They talked to a lot of people, and as I understand, are still in a state of gathering information. But what the FTC staff has said is that they do intend to issue some business guidance, and they expect that sometime in 2015. I would bet that's going to be at the later half, not at the beginning half. But we should see some additional information and suggestions and the FTC's views as to when and how to accomplish disclosure.